After spending 15 years alone, I truly believed I had finally found love again until I uncovered his dirty secret. If you're watching this, subscribe to the channel now and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. My story might just save someone you love. The knife sliced through the birthday cake as my children's faces lit up in the glow of 82 candles. Their smiles never reached their eyes. I could feel it, that subtle current of impatience, as I prepared to speak. Before we eat, I'd like to say something about your father. Today would have been our 57th anniversary, and I remember how he used to. Mom, Michael interjected, his phone buzzing beneath the table. We've heard this story 1,000 times. I caught the look that passed between my children. Michael checking his work emails, Diane whispering to her husband about their summer home renovation, and Patricia texting her new boyfriend under the table. My 5 grandchildren formed a wall of downturned faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. Of course, I smiled, swallowing the memories whole. Let's eat. Later that night, I sat alone in my Victorian home, 15,000 square feet of emptiness filled with antiques and echoes. Martha, my personal assistant of 30 years, helped me up the stairs, her own movements hindered by severe arthritis. Edward called about the annual investment review she mentioned, referring to our family attorney. At 75, Martha's body was failing, but her mind remained razor sharp. Shall I schedule him for next week? Yes, that would be fine. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Eleanor. Martha paused at my bedroom door, her eyes soft with concern. Are you all right? Perfectly fine, I lied, just tired from all the excitement. After she left, I moved to my vanity, staring at the reflection of a stranger. 15 years a widow, 82 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and poorer than I'd ever been. I touched the photo of Robert on my nightstand. His death had never made sense to me. A sudden heart attack, they said, but the hospital seemed in such a rush, the explanations so vague. When I questioned the details, they dismissed me as a confused widow in mourning. That night, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not delicate tears, but body-racking sobs that left me gasping. I cried for Robert, for my children's indifference, for the emptiness that my considerable fortune couldn't fill. I never expected that 2 months later, I would be laughing in a farmer's market with a silver-haired stranger as he helped me pick up apples I'd knocked over. I never imagined that his warm southern drawl would become the voice I most longed to hear, and I certainly never dreamed that Richard Parker, with his kind eyes and gentle hands, would be the man who planned to destroy me. But that's getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you about the day in March when I dropped those apples and a seemingly kind man knelt down to help me. The day I mistook a predator for a savior. These apples know what they're doing. Always making a break for freedom, he said, kneeling beside me on the farmer's market floor, his silver hair catching the morning light. I laughed, a genuine sound that startled me. How long had it been since I'd laughed like that? I'm Richard Parker, he said, handing me the last apple with a slight bow. A younger man stood nearby, smiling politely. And that's my nephew, Jason. Eleanor Blackwood, I replied, suddenly conscious of my appearance. I'd left the house without Martha for the first time in months, while she attended a doctor's appointment for her worsening arthritis. Would you join me for coffee, Eleanor? Richard asked, his southern accent gentle on my name. Unless you have someone waiting? No one's waiting. I admitted, the truth of those words heavier than I intended. At the Market Cafe, our conversation flowed effortlessly. Richard spoke of moving to Connecticut to be closer to Jason, his only family, after losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. Grief makes strange companions of us all, he said, stirring his coffee. Some days I wake up and for a split second, I forget she's gone. I know exactly what you mean, I whispered, the recognition of shared loss creating an instant bond between us. 2 hours passed like minutes. As we prepared to leave, Richard hesitated. I'd very much like to see you again, Eleanor. Would that be something you might consider? My heart fluttered like a teenager's. I'd like that. That evening, Martha listened as I recounted the encounter, her expression shifting between happiness and concern. Just be careful, Eleanor. You're a wealthy woman, and there are people who— It was just coffee, Martha, I interrupted, though the warmth in my cheeks betrayed me. Nothing more. But it was more, much more. Over the next 3 months, Richard became the center of my world. We walked through parks where cherry blossoms rained around us. We attended the symphony, where his hand found mine during Debussy. We discussed books over lunches that stretched into dinners. He listened, truly listened, to stories my own children had long ago tired of hearing. Tell me again about the time you and Robert got lost in Paris, he'd say, leaning forward with genuine interest. Edward, my attorney, noticed the change in me during our annual investment review. I saw you with a gentleman downtown last week, he mentioned carefully. A new friend. When I told him about Richard, Edward suggested a background check, standard procedure for clients of your standing. I declined, feeling offended at the implication. Richard wasn't some fortune hunter. He was a gentleman who made me feel alive again. In July, when my children canceled our Sunday dinner, claiming busy schedules, Richard and Jason appeared at my door with wine and groceries. We thought you shouldn't dine alone, Richard said, his eyes crinkling with warmth. That night, as we cooked together in my kitchen, Richard mentioned he was looking for a more permanent place to stay. The words left my mouth before I could reconsider. The cottage on my property. Rudy has been empty for years. The smile that spread across his face made my heart soar. I had no idea I'd just invited the wolf into my garden. Are you sure about this? Edward asked, sliding the rental agreement across his mahogany desk. His office smelled of leather and caution. It's just the cottage, Edward, not the crown jewels. I signed with a flourish, imagining Richard's face when I told him. And you've known this man for 4 months. Edward's tone was measured, his eyes searching mine. Some people know each other for decades and remain strangers, I countered. Others connect instantly. He nodded slowly. I've included a 6-month term with a clear termination clause just as a precaution. When I told my children about Richard and Jason moving into the cottage, their reactions ranged from skeptical to hostile. Mom, you barely know this man, Michael argued during a rare visit in August. Who is this Richard person anyway? Diane demanded. Patricia was blunter. He's obviously after your money. I stood up, my voice steady. I am elderly, not senile. I can manage my own affairs. Their shocked expressions would have been comical if they weren't so painful. When had my children started seeing me as a liability rather than a person with desires and needs? Richard and Jason moved in during early September. The cottage, separated from the main house by a large garden, gave us privacy while maintaining propriety. Richard surprised me with small gifts, a book of poetry, wildflowers picked during his morning walks, a homemade peach cobbler using his grandmother's secret recipe. But as autumn leaves began to fall, subtle changes emerged. This investment opportunity is perfect, Jason mentioned one evening over dinner, but I need capital to secure my position. My pension doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Richard sighed another day. These medical bills add up. I found myself offering help, small amounts at first. $5,000 for Jason's business opportunity, $10,000 to help Richard with unexpected medical expenses. Martha noticed changes I was blind to. Eleanor, have you been in your office recently? Things seem rearranged. You're imagining things. I dismissed her, but caught her exchanging worried glances with Deborah, my distant cousin who helped organize my library part-time. One afternoon, I overheard Martha on the phone with Edward. I'm concerned, she whispered. She's not herself lately. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. I've known you for 30 years, she said firmly. This isn't like you. You're jealous, I accused, the words tasting bitter even as I spoke them. You've had me all to yourself for years. The hurt in her eyes made me instantly regret my words, but Richard arrived before I could apologize, wrapping his arm around my waist. Everything all right, darling? He asked, his eyes moving between us. Fine, Martha said stiffly, leaning heavily on her walker as she left. Later that week, Edward called about an unusual transaction in one of my smaller accounts. I authorized Richard to make a small investment, I explained, Just 50,000. Edward's silence spoke volumes. It's my money, Edward. I reminded him. Of course it is, he replied. I'd like to discuss some irregularities I've noticed. Can we meet tomorrow? But tomorrow became next week, and next week became next month. Richard always had reasons why I shouldn't go. We had tickets to the theater, or he'd planned a special dinner, or wasn't I feeling a bit under the weather? Lawyers always see problems where none exist, he told me. It's how they justify their fees. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. Eleanor Blackwood Parker, Richard whispered against my hair, has a nice ring to it, don't you think? We stood by the fireplace in my study, an autumn storm raging outside. In his palm lay a small velvet box containing a modest diamond ring. It was my grandmother's, he said. Nothing fancy, but given with all my heart. My fingers trembled as I touched the ring. After 7 months together, Richard had proposed during a candlelit dinner, getting down on one knee despite his troublesome hip. I need time to think, I replied, though my heart had already decided. Richard's face fell momentarily before his smile returned. Of course, darling, take all the time you need. But in the days that followed, something shifted. Richard's attentions intensified, becoming almost suffocating. His comments about my family and advisors grew increasingly pointed. They'll never approve of us, he murmured during an embrace. To them, you're an asset to be protected, not a woman deserving happiness. When my children learned of the proposal through Deborah, I later discovered they arrived unannounced for what Michael called a family intervention. We hired a private investigator, Diane admitted, sliding a folder across the coffee table. You did what? I stared at them, incredulous. There are inconsistencies in his story, Mom, Patricia said gently. His employment history, previous residences, none of it checks out. I reviewed the report with growing unease, but when I confronted Richard that evening, his explanation seemed plausible. Identity theft, he sighed, looking exhausted. Years ago, it's caused endless confusion in my records. He took my hands in his. Do you really think I'd lie to you, Eleanor? The hurt in his eyes made me feel like a monster for doubting him. Over the next weeks, Richard subtly isolated me further. He suggested Martha was becoming too confused to work effectively. He questioned Edward's competence. He nurtured my resentment toward my children, who never cared about your happiness until someone threatened their inheritance. I found myself agreeing with him more and more. When Richard proposed a small ceremony in Las Vegas before Christmas, I agreed, but insisted on a prenuptial agreement. If you really trust me, why the legal precautions? He asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. It's not about trust, I assured him. It's about doing things properly. Richard reluctantly agreed, but suggested using an attorney he'd met through connections at the golf club to expedite the process. Edward was alarmed when I mentioned an outside attorney. When he finally reviewed the document, his concerns were immediate. Eleanor, these clauses buried in Section 12 would effectively give him control over. You're overreacting, I interrupted, Richard's words echoing in my mind. You're just trying to create problems. We married in a small Las Vegas chapel in mid-December with only Jason and Martha as witnesses. I'd insisted Martha attend despite Richard's objections. She's been with me 30 years, I said firmly. She'll be there. Martha's expression during the ceremony haunts me still, a mixture of resignation and deep sadness. Upon our return, I discovered my children had organized a separate Christmas celebration without inviting me. The family rupture, though painful, drove me further into Richard's arms. We don't need them, he assured me, kissing my forehead. We have each other now. I didn't notice how his eyes lingered on the safe in my office or how he smiled when I turned away. Just sign here, darling. Richard's finger tapped the bottom of the document. It's just routine paperwork for that joint account we discussed. January 2025 had brought heavy snow that isolated us in the main house. Richard had gradually moved his belongings from the cottage, leaving Jason to occupy it alone. Shouldn't I read it first? I asked, reaching for my reading glasses. Richard's laugh was light, but carried an edge I'd never noticed before. It's exactly what we discussed. No need to strain your eyes with all that legal jargon, he said, ignoring the unease settling in my stomach. Martha's visits had reduced to once weekly due to her worsening health. During her last visit, she dropped a teacup when Richard entered the room unexpectedly. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "Your assistant seems increasingly unsteady," Richard commented after she left. "Perhaps it's time to consider a replacement. Martha has been with me for decades," I replied defensively. "And you've been more than generous," he soothed. "But at some point, loyalty must yield to practicality." That night, I found myself studying Richard's face as he slept beside me. The kind gentleman who'd helped me pick up apples seemed like a distant memory. This man, my husband of barely a month, somehow looked different in repose, harder, calculating. I dismissed the thought as ridiculous. In February, Richard and Jason mentioned a 3-day business trip to finalize an important investment with part of my money, $200,000 I'd authorized for what Richard described as a guaranteed return. The morning after they left, Martha arrived looking unusually determined. She wasn't alone. Her grandson Troy, a computer science student who occasionally helped with my technical issues, accompanied her. "Eleanor, we need to talk," Martha said, her voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "If this is about Richard." "It is," Martha nodded to Troy, who opened his laptop. "Troy installed security cameras in your office last month at my request. You did what I felt anger rising. How dare you?" "Please just watch," Troy said quietly. The screen showed Jason systematically photographing documents from my desk when I wasn't home. Another clip revealed Richard and Jason in intense conversation. "The old lady is making everything so easy," Richard laughed, his voice completely different from the gentle tone he used with me. "Once we have access to the main accounts, we'll transfer everything and disappear." My world collapsed in that moment. I watched numbly as Troy showed me more evidence. Emails between Richard and Jason discussing their exit strategy, searches on my computer for information about my accounts, and most devastating, a background check revealing Richard Parker's true identity, Gerald Simmons, a known con artist who targeted wealthy widows. "Edward's been investigating," Martha explained. "Jason isn't his nephew, he's his son. They've done this before." I felt physically ill. "How much? How much have they taken?" "About $500,000 so far," Troy said gently. "But they were planning something bigger. They're coming back tomorrow expecting to access your main accounts." My shock gave way to something else, something cold and hard and clarifying. I thought of my late husband Robert, who'd built his business empire through strategic thinking. "He always said the best defense is a strategic offense," I murmured, looking up at Martha and Troy. I straightened my shoulders. "Call Edward. Tell him to bring the police, but not until I say so." "What are you planning?" Martha asked. "They think I'm a helpless old woman," I replied, my voice steady. "It's time to show them how wrong they are." "How was your trip?" I asked, pouring Gerald. I couldn't think of him as Richard anymore, a glass of his favorite bourbon. My hands didn't shake at all. "Productive," he replied, settling into the armchair in my study. Jason stood by the fireplace, examining the antique clock on the mantel. "I'm glad to hear it," I smiled, sipping my own drink. "While you were gone, I've been thinking about our future." Gerald's eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh yes." I moved to my desk, retrieving a folder. "I've been going through some of Robert's papers. Did I ever mention the offshore account he established in the Cayman Islands?" The barely concealed flash of greed in Gerald's eyes sickened me. "No, I don't believe you did," he replied carefully. "It's substantial," I continued, watching their reactions. "Robert was always cautious about taxes. The account hasn't been touched since his death." Jason moved closer, his facade of respectful interest slipping. "How substantial are we talking?" 11 figures, I said quietly. "But accessing it requires specific documentation. Robert was very particular about security." Gerald leaned forward, his mask of affection completely gone now. "And you have this documentation?" Some of it I pulled out, several official-looking papers, actually worthless documents Troy had helped me. "The rest is with Edward, your lawyer." Gerald frowned. Why involve him? Legal necessity. I shrugged. But we have an appointment tomorrow to complete the paperwork. By this time next week, we could access everything. Gerald and Jason exchanged glances that spoke volumes. That's wonderful news, Gerald said, reaching for my hand. You know I only want what's best for us. I know exactly what you want, I replied, my voice hardening. Gerald. His hand froze midair. What did you call me? Gerald Simmons, I repeated. That is your real name, isn't it? Or do you prefer to be called by the name you used in Arizona? Or was it Florida, where you last targeted a widow? His face transformed, charm giving way to cold calculation. You've been busy while we were gone. You really thought I was just a helpless old woman, didn't you? So desperate for affection that I'd hand over everything I've worked for without question. Gerald stood, his posture menacing. You don't understand the situation you're in. I understand perfectly. I pressed a small button under my desk, the signal to Edward and the police waiting outside. The question is, do you? Jason moved toward the door, but it opened before he reached it. Edward entered, followed by 2 police officers. Gerald Simmons, Jason Simmons, the lead officer announced. You're under arrest for fraud and elder financial abuse. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Gerald lunged toward my desk, grabbing the fake documents. Jason shoved past Edward toward another exit. The officers pursued, but in the confusion, both men escaped through the garden door. They won't get far, Edward assured me, his arm around my shoulders. The police have the perimeter covered. But as I surveyed my violated home, I knew this wasn't over. Gerald and Jason might be caught, but the damage they'd done to my trust, my dignity, my sense of safety couldn't be undone by handcuffs alone. Are you all right? Martha asked, entering the room after the commotion subsided. No, I admitted honestly, but I will be. We recovered most of the documents they took, Detective Wilson said, placing a folder on my kitchen table 3 days later. And we've frozen the accounts they accessed. But I have to be honest, Mrs. Blackwood, recovering your money will be challenging. Gerald and Jason had been captured attempting to cross the Canadian border with fake passports and $150,000 in cash from my accounts. How many others? I asked quietly. The detective hesitated. We've identified 3 other victims in different states. A similar pattern. He targeted wealthy widows, established relationships over several months, then systematically drained their accounts. Edward, seated beside me, opened the folder. What about Deborah Lewis, Ella Lehner's cousin? I stared at him. Deborah? What does she have to do with this? The detective exchanged a glance with Edward. Miss Lewis has been questioned. Her bank records show several large deposits coinciding with Mr. Simmons's appearance in your life. She's been helping them. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. Deborah, who had organized my library for years, who had joined family dinners, who had access to my personal papers and schedules, she admitted to providing information about my routines and finances. Detective Wilson confirmed she claims Gerald approached her months before accidentally meeting you at the market. The calculated nature of the deception made me physically ill. Nothing had been real, not our first meeting, not his stories, not his touch, all engineered to gain access to my wealth. We found this in their hotel room, the detective added, sliding a notebook toward me. It appears to be Gerald's observations. I opened it with trembling hands. Pages of detailed notes about me, my routines, preferences, insecurities, cruel assessments of my appearance and behavior, strategies for manipulation. My entire relationship reduced to a predatory playbook. Subject responds well to physical affection, I read aloud, my voice hollow. Becomes pliant and agreeable after compliments about appearance. Mention deceased husband to trigger emotional vulnerability. Martha reached over, gently closing the notebook. You don't need to read anymore, but I couldn't stop. I flipped to the last entry, dated just before their final business trip. Elena increasingly suspicious. Time to accelerate extraction and exit strategy. Jason will secure remaining documents while I finalize access to primary accounts. Target value approximately $10 million. Accessible potential 30 million through posthumous inheritance. The clinical coldness of the words froze my blood. Posthumous inheritance. The detective and Edward exchanged glances. We believe they may have been planning. Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. They were going to kill me. I finished for him, the truth crystallizing with terrible clarity. After getting access to everything, they were going to arrange an accident. The room spun around me. All those nights I'd slept beside him, vulnerable and trusting. All those meals he'd prepared with his special ingredients. The way he discouraged my blood pressure medication, claiming natural remedies were better. I want a full toxicology screening, I said suddenly. Hair, blood, everything. Edward nodded. I've already arranged it. The doctor will be here in an hour. That night, alone in my bedroom, I couldn't bear to sleep in the master suite we'd shared. I found myself staring at Robert's photograph. You tried to warn me, I whispered, remembering my suspicions about his death, all those hospital irregularities I questioned. You were trying to protect me even then. Something shifted inside me, grief hardening into resolve. I'd spent months as a victim, manipulated and deceived. But now, with Gerald and Jason in custody and the full extent of their scheme exposed, I had a choice. I could retreat into shame and fear, or I could transform this nightmare into something meaningful. The next morning, I called Michael. I need your help, I said when he answered, my voice trembling. Stronger than it had been in months. It's about your father's death. I think you were right. Something wasn't right about it, Mom. His surprise was evident. What's going on? I'm through being manipulated and silenced. I told him it's time to uncover the truth. All of it. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was changed. Eyes clearer, jaw firmer, shoulders squared. Gerald had awakened something in me he never intended. Not just anger, but purpose. Mrs. Blackwood, you understand this case will be difficult to pursue after 15 years. The medical malpractice attorney leaned forward across his desk, his expression grave. The statute of limitations can be extended in cases of fraud or concealment. I finished for him, which is exactly what happened with my husband's death. Michael sat beside me, nodding. The hospital altered records. We have evidence. It had been 3 weeks since Gerald's arrest in March. While the fraud case against him proceeded, I'd launched investigations of my own, starting with Robert's suspicious death. Michael had finally revealed what he'd discovered years ago, discrepancies in Robert's medical reports suggesting negligence that likely contributed to his heart attack, followed by an institutional cover-up. Why didn't you tell me? I'd asked him. You were devastated, Mom. I thought knowing would only cause more pain. He'd looked away, and then it seemed too late. The attorney reviewed our evidence. Inconsistent timestamps on medical records, missing pages from Robert's file, and statements from a retired nurse who remembered irregularities in the case. I'll take it, he decided, but the process will be grueling. Eve survived verse, I replied. Meanwhile, the toxicology tests confirmed my fears. Elevated levels of arsenic in my hair samples, consistent with low-dose poisoning over several months, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to gradually weaken me, making any eventual accident more plausible. That evening, I hosted a family dinner, the first since Gerald's deception. My children arrived looking nervous, as if entering a minefield. Thank you for coming, I said as we gathered in the dining room. Martha had outdone herself, preparing all our family favorites despite her arthritis. Mom, we're so sorry, Diane began. We should have. I raised my hand. No apologies tonight. I made my own choices. But we saw the signs, Patricia insisted, and instead of really talking to you, we just judged and I pushed you away. I acknowledged we all contributed to the distance between us. Michael poured wine for everyone. To new beginnings then, and to truth, I added, meeting each of their eyes. No more secrets, no more avoiding difficult conversations. As dinner progressed, the tension gradually dissolved. We talked about Robert's case, about the ongoing investigation into Gerald's network, about my children's lives and concerns. When my grandson Jacob asked how I discovered Gerald's true identity, I credited Martha and Troy. Troy set up cameras. I was impressed by the kid, smart enough that I've asked him to overhaul all my security systems. I confirmed, and to help me understand more about what Gerald was doing with my accounts. My children exchanged glances. "What are you thinking, Mom?" Michael asked cautiously. "I've been contacted by Gerald's other victims," I explained, "women who, like me, were targeted for their wealth and isolation. Most lost everything." "That's terrible," Diane murmured. "Yes, it is, and it's also preventable." I straightened in my chair. "I'm thinking about creating a resource center for seniors vulnerable to these schemes. Education, protection, legal assistance." "Mom, that's a wonderful idea," Patricia said. "I'll need help," I continued. "Michael, your technology expertise would be invaluable. Diane, your PR background could raise awareness. Patricia, your counseling experience could help develop support resources." For the first time in years, I saw something in their eyes besides obligation or concern. I saw respect. Later, as my family prepared to leave, Michael lingered behind. "I found something else in Dad's papers," he said quietly. "Letters he wrote to you, never sent. They were in his office safe." He handed me an envelope, yellowed with age. "I think you should read them." Alone in my study, I opened the first letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Elainer," Robert's familiar handwriting brought tears to my eyes. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. There are things I never told you, threats to our family that I handled alone to protect you." I read through the night, absorbing Robert's secret battles with business rivals who'd eventually targeted his health. By dawn, I understood not just how my husband had died, but how he'd lived, protecting us until his final breath. I placed the letters in my safe, then called Edward. "I need you to set up a meeting," I said when he answered, "with Detective Wilson and the prosecutor handling Gerald's case. I have new information that changes everything." The prosecution offers 3 years with a possibility of parole, Gerald's attorney announced in the courthouse conference room in exchange for full cooperation regarding his other victims. It was early May, and 6 weeks had passed since Gerald's arrest. I sat across from him, separated by a table and 15 years of deception. "Not good enough," I replied, my voice steady. Gerald looked different in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow. His charm evaporated without tailored suits and practiced smiles. His eyes, however, remained calculating. "Mrs. Blackwood," the prosecutor began, "this is actually a reasonable 3 years for destroying multiple lives for a scheme that included plans to murder me." I shook my head. "Unacceptable." Gerald's attorney leaned forward. "Murder accusations are completely unfounded." "We have his notebook," I interrupted, "his references to posthumous inheritance and detailed notes about my medication. The prosecution has my hair samples showing elevated levels of arsenic consistent with slow poisoning." The room fell silent. "That's circumstantial," Gerald's attorney argued, but with less conviction, perhaps. I opened my handbag, removing an envelope. "But we also have these." I slid across photographs of pill capsules that had been carefully opened and refilled with white powder. Troy had found them hidden in Gerald's personal items left behind during his hasty escape. Laboratory analysis confirmed they contained arsenic compounds. The prosecutor straightened, suddenly alert. "This is the first I'm seeing these. My security consultant discovered them while securing my property. We've already provided them to Detective Wilson." Gerald's face contorted with rage. "You manipulative, Mr. Simmons," his attorney warned. "Too late. 15 to 20 years, I stated calmly. No possibility of parole for at least 12. Full restitution to all victims, or we go to trial with this evidence and pursue maximum sentences." The meeting ended with Gerald being escorted out, his threats echoing down the hallway. His attorney remained behind, suddenly eager to negotiate. Outside the courthouse, Edward squeezed my shoulder. "You've changed, Elon." "No," I corrected him. "I've remembered who I always was." That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Jason Simmons, released on bail while awaiting his separate trial, stood on my doorstep, looking nothing like the confident young man who had lived in my cottage. "You shouldn't be here," I said through the security system. "The restraining order." "I know," he interrupted. I needed to apologize." "Save it for the judge," I replied, turning to leave. "Wait," he called desperately. "There's something you should know about Gerald's network. There are others involved, people you might know." I paused, then pressed the intercom again. "Tell the police, not me. They won't believe me without evidence." His voice dropped. "But I know where to find it, information that could help the other victims recover their money." I studied his face on the security monitor. Was this another manipulation? "Why come to me?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who outsmarted him," Jason admitted, "and because I'm trying to fix what I can." For years, Jason had watched his father prey on vulnerable women while he'd willingly participated. Something in him had clearly shifted. Perhaps seeing Gerald's willingness to poison an elderly woman had finally crossed a moral line even he couldn't ignore. "The police detective handling the case will contact you tomorrow," he told me. "Tell him everything. If your information helps recover stolen funds, I'll ask him to consider it during your sentencing." As I walked away from the monitor, Martha appeared in the hallway, leaning on her new electric scooter, a gift from me to ease her mobility. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "A desperate man looking for redemption." Martha studied my face. "And will he find it?" "That depends on whether he's truly changed," I said, "or just playing another angle." I slept soundly that night, no longer haunted by Gerald's ghost. Son was sincere or manipulative no longer mattered. I had reclaimed my power, my voice, and most importantly, my trust in my own judgment. Gerald had taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that strength often comes disguised as heartbreak. "I'd like to start small," I explained to Edward, reviewing the preliminary paperwork spread across my dining room table. "A community resource center first, before expanding into a formal foundation." It was early June, 3 months since Gerald's deception had been exposed. His case was moving through the legal system, with a plea deal expected by August based on the overwhelming evidence and Jason's testimony against him. "The cottage would be perfect," I continued. "It's separate from the main house, but still on the property, where I can oversee things." Edward nodded approvingly. "Starting local makes sense. Build a model that works before scaling up." Martha entered with a tray of tea, her new assistant Sam helping navigate her scooter through the doorway. At 76, Martha had finally agreed to reduce her responsibilities, but remained enthusiastic about my new project. "Troy called," she announced. "He's finished the security assessment and has some ideas for the resource center's technical setup." In the weeks following Gerald's arrest, Troy had become an unexpected ally. His expertise had not only secured my home but helped track financial transactions that led to recovering nearly 40% of what Gerald had stolen from me and his other victims, a remarkably high recovery rate for such fraud cases. "I've been thinking," I said, taking the tea Martha offered. "The resource center will need educational materials, workshops, and counseling resources. We'll need people with expertise. Your children each bring valuable skills." Edward observed. "Have you discussed it with them?" I nodded. "Michael's already designing a secure communication system for seniors to report suspicious activities. Diane's developing an awareness campaign. Patricia's creating a trauma support framework for victims." The doorbell rang, and Sam went to answer it. Moments later, the room filled with my family, all 3 children, their spouses, and several of my grandchildren carrying folders and laptops. "Sorry we're late," Michael called. "Traffic was terrible." Diane immediately began pinning concept boards to my cork wall. "I've outlined the first 3 months of public messaging. We're focusing on empowerment rather than fear." Patricia set up her laptop. "I've contacted 2 therapists who specialize in elder trauma. They're interested in providing pro bono services 1 day a week." I watched in amazement as my family transformed my dining room into a command center. My grandchildren offered perspectives on reaching younger family members who might notice warning signs in their grandparents. Troy arrived with flowcharts of security protocols. "We've scheduled the cottage renovation to begin next week," Michael informed me. We should be able to open the resource center by September if everything stays on track. I echoed, surprised by the timeline too slow. Diane asked, misinterpreting my reaction. We could push harder. But no, it's just I struggled to find words. 3 months ago, I was isolated, manipulated, nearly destroyed, and now you're fighting back. Patricia finished for me, and we're with you. Michael squeezed my shoulder. We should have been with you all along, Mom. We got so caught up in our own lives. What matters is now, I said firmly, and what we build from here. Later, as the impromptu meeting wound down, Troy approached with news about Jason's cooperation. His information led to 2 arrests in Florida, he reported quietly. Other members of Gerald's network have been identified, and they've recovered funds from offshore accounts. And Barbara? I asked, referring to Gerald's ex-wife, whom Jason had mentioned during our investigation. She had divorced Gerald decades ago after discovering his first scams and had been trying to track his activities ever since. She's agreed to speak at our first workshop, Troy confirmed. She brings a unique perspective, someone who saw the warning signs from the beginning. As my family departed with action items and timelines, I found myself standing in the garden, looking at the cottage that had housed my would-be destroyer. Workers would soon transform it into a place of protection and healing. Michael joined me, following my gaze. Are you sure you want to keep it? We could tear it down, build something new. I shook my head. No. Transforming it is better. A reminder that what hurts us can become what heals us with the right perspective. He nodded thoughtfully. Dad would be proud, you know? Yes, I agreed, thinking of Robert's letters. He understood that protecting others sometimes means fighting back. The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, but for the first time in months, I felt no darkness within. Gerald had sought to diminish me. Instead, he had accidentally catalyzed my rebirth. Mrs. Blackwood, your 9 o'clock appointment is here. Sam's voice came through the intercom in my temporary office, a converted sunroom overlooking the garden where the cottage renovation was nearing completion. It was mid-June, and in the past week alone, we had conducted 2 educational workshops for seniors, established a confidential reporting hotline, and connected 3 potential fraud victims with legal resources before they lost significant assets.
Thank you, Sam.
Please show them in. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and nervous hands. I recognized her immediately from the case files. Barbara Simmons, I said, rising to greet her. Thank you for coming in person. Gerald's ex-wife shook my hand firmly. I should have done this years ago. Tracked down his victims, created a network, warned people. You tried, I reminded her. You contacted authorities after each marriage. Not hard enough, she said, placing a folder on my desk. These are all the records I kept. Every alias, every location, patterns I noticed. It might help identify other victims who haven't come forward. As we review, Barbara explained how she discovered Gerald's true nature during their marriage 30 years ago. He has 2 children, Jason, who you know, and an older son from before our marriage. Thomas hasn't spoken to Gerald in decades. He saw through his father early on. I appreciate this information, I said sincerely. It will help our resource center identify patterns and warning signs. Barbara hesitated, then reached into her purse. There's something else. Gerald sent this from prison. She placed a sealed envelope on the desk. He insisted I deliver it personally. My blood ran cold. I want nothing from him, I said. I understand, Barbara replied. He didn't touch the envelope again. I told him that, but he was persistent. I'm not here as his messenger. I'm here to support your work, but I felt you should know about this. I considered the envelope. Has it been screened? The prison inspected it, she confirmed. It's just a letter. After Barbara left, with promises to return for our next workshop as a speaker, I called Martha, now serving as the Resource Center's administrative director. Should I open it? I asked after explaining the situation. That depends, she replied. Are you strong enough to face whatever game he's playing without letting it affect you? I looked around my office at the planning documents for the Resource Center, the photos of seniors from our first workshop, the schedule of upcoming educational sessions. Yes, I realized. I am. The letter was brief. Elena, you won. I underestimated you in every way possible. This isn't an apology. I don't apologize. But I do recognize worthy opponents. You transformed from prey to predator with impressive speed. I set the letter aside, unmoved by his attempt at a power play disguised as respect. He still didn't understand. I hadn't become a predator. I'd simply refused to remain prey. That evening, my family gathered for our weekly dinner, a tradition we'd maintained religiously since reconciling. As we sat in the garden watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I shared Barbara's visit and Gerald's letter. He still doesn't get it, Patricia observed. He sees everything as a power game. Some people can't comprehend motives beyond their own, Michael agreed. As conversation flowed around me, I found myself observing rather than participating, taking in the tableau my life had become. My grandchildren arguing good-naturedly about politics, Diane showing Martha photos from her recent vacation, Troy discussing security protocols with Michael. 4 months ago, I'd been a lonely, diminished version of myself, wealthy in possessions but impoverished in purpose, connection, and self-knowledge. Gerald had intended to destroy me. Instead, his deception had shattered the protective shell I'd built around myself after Robert's death, forcing me to reassemble the pieces into something stronger, more authentic, and infinitely more powerful. As the evening light faded, I excused myself briefly and walked to Robert's memorial in the garden. You would be proud, I told his photograph. Not of what happened, but of what came after. When I returned to the table, my youngest granddaughter Emma was sharing her plans to intern at the resource center during her summer break. Grandma, she said, noticing me standing in the doorway, I was just telling everyone I want to focus on developing peer education programs young people can help their grandparents recognize warning signs. I smiled, taking my place at the head of the table, not as a victim or a survivor, but as the architect of my own renaissance. That's wonderful, Emma, I said, looking around at the family that had found its way back to me. Education is our most powerful tool. At 83, with more scars than I'd ever anticipated and more purpose than I'd ever imagined, I finally understood what Gerald never could, that my value had never been in my wealth, but in my capacity to transform, to fall, to rise, and to help others do the same. And that, unlike money, was something no one could ever take from me. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.